Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone joining us from across Canada and South Asia and beyond. My name is Vina Najibulla, and I serve as the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today to the webinar entitled Canada's G7 Presidency in India, Prospects for Bilateral and Global Cooperation. Canada will, of course, chair the G7 summit in less than a week's time here in Canada at a moment of extraordinary geopolitical flux, trade disruptions, a grinding conflict in Ukraine, supply chain upheavals, and intensifying great power competition. And at the same time, emerging powers, and perhaps none more than India, are assuming a larger role in shaping the global agenda. New Delhi has been invited to every G7 meeting since 2019. And has been an important voice for the Global South, a global majority at these summits. And of course, in keeping with that tradition, Prime Minister Carney invited Prime Minister Modi just on Friday of last week to Canada's G7 summit as well. So this webinar is exceptionally well timed. We hope to unpack a number of topics, including what were the reasons behind Prime Minister Carney's invitation, how that was received in India, what are the dynamics that are shaping Canada's relationship with India, as well as India-US relationship, and what each Canada and India are hoping to achieve at the summit, both bilaterally, but also in key relationships with the US and others who will be gathered here. To help us unpack these issues, I'm joined by two outstanding guests. We're really thrilled to have them. Dr. Raja Mohan, who's a Distinguished Fellow, Council for Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi. He was also recently an Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada visiting fellow and spent some time with us here in Canada. He's one of India's most respected strategic thinkers. He has advised several Indian governments and currently publishes a very influential weekly column for the Indian Express. And Dr. Mohan is joining us from New Delhi today, so thank you and welcome.
Thanks.
And then we have Dr. Michael Kugelman, who very recently joined Asia Pacific Foundation as a non-resident senior fellow. We're extremely pleased to have Michael on our extended team. And of course, he's also the founding director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center and has written extensively on US-South Asia, US-India relations. He regularly comments for the Foreign Policy magazine. And of course, just recently, in fact, this weekend, published something with us at the Asia Pacific Foundation on India-Pakistan, recent conflict and implications for Canada. So really terrific guests who will, for the next 60 minutes, help us unpack all of these issues. In terms of the flow for the time, we'll have opening remarks from each of our guests, then some questions from me. And then for the last about 15, 20 minutes, we will take questions from our audience. And I see a number of folks joining us already. So please use the chat function, the Q&A function, as soon as you're ready to put in your questions, and we will get to them at the end of it. There are also a few housekeeping notes in the chat as well, so you can see that. Of course, this is an on-the-record conversation, and we will be sharing this on our website after the fact. So with those introductory remarks, let me just dive straight in. So Raja, I will turn to you to maybe speak a little bit about how the invitation to the G7 was received in India. What are India's objectives for this G7, both with the US, of course. I know President Trump is sort of top of mind for everybody around the world, but also how India sees this for a potential in the reset between Canada and India as well. So over to you, Raja.
Yeah, thanks, Vina. Thanks for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. Firstly, let me begin by saying I think it's been very, very impressive to see Prime Minister Carney navigate this very tricky transition of 3 years of difficult relationship and the fact that he knew that there would be domestic opposition to it. So given all this, I think the way he's managed this to move ahead and frame it in such a way that it is least complicated for the Indian side. So that is the I think he's really done well. I think it fits in with his larger strategy. I mean, I'm sure you can say more on that. Given the tensions in the Canada-US relations and the need for diversification, we've already seen some of that in Canada's engagement with Europe, with Japan and others. So I think that is another important factor. On the Indian side too, I would say you had the Indian media writing off, saying that, look, it's not happening. If it comes too late, he won't come. I mean, it's like jumping to conclusions like that without clearly no knowledge. And I think the Foreign Office didn't rise to the bait. I mean, they didn't come and say, look, bad things or angry things. I think they knew that there was a channel working in the back, and that the two sides were finding a way to do this without provoking too much reaction. And I think once the conversation took place a few days before Friday between Anita Anand, Canada's foreign minister, and India's foreign minister Jaishankar, I think you knew that they were moving in the right direction, whatever the public optics might have been. So I think India too has reacted in a measured manner. For India, I would say it's really I think we are at a very critical moment in the world politics, where it's not just Russia and China and the tensions between them and the West. I think it is the divisions within the West that have actually today probably that is far more consequential in terms of how Trump has played this out. If Trump is, you have NATO, you have Five Eyes, you have Canada, you couldn't have gotten closer relations than with any other country. But I think the way he's dealt with some of these issues and the way Europe has reacted, where Canada has reacted, I think it shows that, look, we are at a turning point within the West of how the future arrangements will play themselves out. So I think for India, it's a critical moment globally. I mean, just that's one part of it. You have a global trading system in a crisis. The multilateral system is in a crisis. So for India, which has been a regular invitee to the G7, I think not being there would have been a setback, I would say. Fortunately, that's not happened. So for India, I think there was quite a bit of relief. Certainly, what are the social media stuff that was going on? The foreign policy community, I think, is fairly relieved, and that those who are aware of the difficult history of this relationship and the tragedies that it had to go through, realize that, look, I think the two sides have at least put themselves in a decent place to address some of these issues. So I would say reset is one part of this visit, because for India, there's a major trade negotiation going on with the US. With the European Union, there's progress. With UK, we've just done a trade negotiation. So I think it's really a much bigger than just what happens to India-Canada problems. That my sense, I would just say one thing on that, and I'll stop there. There, I would say even during Trudeau's time, the two establishments were beginning to talk. Vina, you know that they were trying to develop a law enforcement dialogue. Even when I came to Ottawa, we heard that they were trying to find ways to deal with the problem of the question of extraterritorial actions alleged on the part of India, and for India, the concerns about how terrorism and hate speech are managed. And I think once the two sides managed to take this into a serious, without the public, but taking this purposefully and positively, that I think creates a space to do the larger politics, the political reset, the economic reset, because both Canada and India have a lot in common. Fortunately, we saw in the last couple of years, despite all the stuff that was happening, saw the Canadian investments were going up in India. The business leaders were engaging with each other. So my sense is, I think good sense has prevailed. Both sides have navigated the crisis well. And I think they've set the stage not only for engaging on the difficult issues, but also to work together to look at the broader challenges on multilateralism, on technology, on trade. So my sense is Canada has historically been a major multilateral actor, India too. So I would say this is really, we could turn this into a new beginning in the bilateral relationship. I would even say on energy and science, for example, nuclear, India first reactor was built in partnership with Canada. That was a small reactor. So I think there are multiple possibilities here as two large economies with a lot of common traditions as well as complementarities. So I would say it's a long overdue, I think, this turn, and hopefully they'll be able to manage whatever the problems that will come up in the public domain in both the countries.
Great. Thank you so much, Roger. You've put out a lot on the table already, and I certainly want to follow up on a couple of items, including sort of this idea of law enforcement cooperation. The readout from Prime Minister Carney very much stressed that point. That wasn't necessarily something in the readout from Prime Minister Modi's side, so I want us to come back to that topic, as well as all the issues that you noted in terms of potential collaboration on the energy side, on the critical minerals and infrastructure and other projects. So sort of both sets of unpacking further the irritants in the relationship, if you will, but also the opportunities. But let me bring in Michael into the conversation. You are joining us from Washington, and from Washington's perspective, Michael, maybe you can lay out why it's important to have India at the table, but also speak a little bit to kind of the moment that India finds itself on the world stage post the Pakistan-India flare-up and sort of the return of this hyphenation and what this G7 might mean in that context. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Vina. Great to be a part of this discussion, and I'm really excited about my new association with APF. So, to this question of why was it important that India be invited, I think that one can point here to three Ps, and I'm coming down to very fundamental levels here. Power, partnerships, and priorities. So in terms of power, I mean, we know that the G7, it's a group of some of the world's most powerful democracies and economies, and India is the world's largest democracy, its fastest growing major economy, and soon, if not already, will be the world's fourth largest economy overall. All this despite some pretty significant economic bumps in India due to unemployment, low consumption rates, some up and down GDP growth over the last fiscal year. Partnerships, other than Canada, India has close relations with all of the G7 members, including some of its very closest partners like France and Japan are part of this. In terms of priorities, if you look at Prime Minister Carney's stated priorities for this G7 summit, I'd say that most of them align quite closely with India's own objectives and strengths. Furthering infrastructure investment, promoting energy security, driving growth through AI. These are all things that India is prioritizing both at home and abroad. Now, seen from a strictly Canada-India bilateral lens, it may not seem important or even wise to invite Modi to this summit. I mean, quite frankly, many commentators had suggested earlier that inviting Modi now may pose a risk, given that the relationship remains quite fragile, even though both sides, I think we can agree, are clearly committed to trying to get relations back on track. And consider the Khalistan issue. I mean, the main reason why bilateral relations have been so tense, and I argue, and here I reference the piece that you kindly referred to that I recently published for you guys. The recent India-Pakistan conflict has amplified the sensitivities around the Khalistan issue, and this could potentially pose new challenges for Canada-India ties. I mean, this is something that flared during that conflict. It provoked new threats to India from Khalistan groups, including the Sikhs for Justice group that counted Hardeep Singh Nijjar as a member, and of course, we know who he was. The senior Indian delegations dispatched around the world in recent days to seek support for India's position during the conflict with Pakistan have sought to refocus more global attention on India's terrorism concerns. And these concerns, they don't necessarily only refer to Pakistan-based Islamist terrorism. New Delhi views Khalistan supporters as terrorists and has called Canada a safe haven for terrorists. So, given all this, India it may not be that likely to be in the mood for compromises or concessions on this very complex, sensitive, delicate issue. Also, and this gets into the US angle a bit here, India, I think, has likely been emboldened by what appears, at least for now, to be a bit of a shift in the US approach to the issue of Khalistan. I mean, the India-Pakistan conflict may have caused some tensions for US-India relations, and it has because of President Trump's public messaging about the ceasefire and his call for a Kashmir resolution. But one of the main tension points in US-India relations during the Biden administration, that being the Khalistan issue, appears to have melted away. I mean, the joint statement following the Trump-Modi White House meeting in February, it pledged, quote, decisive action against those that, quote, threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of both nations, which to me seems like a reference to Khalistan supporters. And in April, just a few weeks ago, the FBI announced the arrest of one such figure in California for planning terrorist attacks in India. He was wanted in India for that reason. So this is all to say that Canada-India relations could face some new challenges, even as they look to rebound. But coming back to this issue of Prime Minister Modi getting invited to the G7, as I suggested earlier, if you look at it through a wider geopolitical and geoeconomic lens, it's practically a no-brainer. I mean, you have to have India at the table. And I think this is one big reason why India has been invited to all G7 summits since 2019, because India is an essential non-member contributor to the G7 because of what it brings to the table. One final note I'll make here, Vina, before I send things back to you, is on the implications of Modi's participation in the summit for Canada-India relations. I've said that bilateral ties could face some new challenges because of the India-Pakistan conflict, but I'd argue that Modi coming to Canada, even if he might have been invited for more for geopolitical and other reasons, more so than bilateral reasons, this could still help bilateral ties. It could be a confidence building measure. Had he not been invited for whatever reason, or had he not accepted the invitation, well, mainly if had he not been invited, this likely would have raised some questions in New Delhi that might have made progress toward a reset more difficult. But I think Modi's participation could help build momentum for a détente, momentum that arguably began when the new government took office in Ottawa, continued with the call that was mentioned before between the two foreign ministers, and I'd argue could continue more given the aftermath of this recent Indian conflict with Pakistan. How might the aftermath of this conflict bring momentum to Canada-India ties? And for one thing, with the conflict over, and I think Raja mentioned this before, India is pivoting back to what's been one of its core foreign policy priorities for quite some time, particularly in recent months, that being pursuing trade deals. And I think this is a goal that's been intensified by the Trump administration's tariff policies. This creates an opening for Canada-India commercial relations. If you look at the figures, despite all the bilateral tensions more broadly, bilateral trade has remained strikingly resilient over the last few years. And also the India-Pakistan conflict, I would say, accentuated several key shared concerns of both Canada and India. One of them is Islamist terrorism. Canadians have been targeted by this threat. I mean, you'll of course recall that several Canadians died in the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks. The other key shared concern accentuated by that conflict is the actions of China. I mean, India had sought to pursue a limited détente with Beijing in recent months, but the fact that Chinese-made jets were used in combat operations by Pakistan against India for the first time is a reminder to New Delhi of the multifaceted threat that China poses to India's security interests. So to conclude, bottom line, Modi's participation in this summit can help bilateral relations, even if bilateral relations may not have been the main consideration that prompted him to be invited.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michael. And I love your framing around partnerships, power, and priorities. And it's sort of a no-brainer given the agenda and the significance of Delhi in shaping of that global agenda, that India be at the table, but that bilaterally, while this may provide an opportunity for building on the momentum for a reset, there are also risks. And I appreciated your piece precisely for the risks that you pointed out. And that kind of brings me to the point that I wanted to bring Raja, you back to talk about the irritants in the relationship, national security concerns. Obviously, Canada's concern that India has violated sovereignty by engaging in transnational repression in the case of Niger, but also others. And of course, India's concerns with respect to Khalistani extremism and Canada not taking the issue seriously from India's perspective. So it seems like there's some movement in that. But of course, Michael is correct in pointing out that the recent developments with India-Pakistan might actually make this a bit more tricky. So could I ask you to share a little bit of how you see this moving forward? What are these mechanisms that are in place? What confidence building measures could be put around the summit, but also as a follow-up to the summit to deal with this issue and to manage some of the risks that Michael, I think, correctly points out?
Look, I think given the sensitive nature of these two issues, I mean, the public discourse and kind of, arguing about this endlessly, either on the basis of principle or on the basis of partial evidence. I mean, I think we've done that for 2.5 years, and both sides have articulated their grievances of what are the issues. In the end, look, any two practical governments know, look, whatever the formal positions are, in the end, you need to come to some kind of way out. There, I think Canada's concerns about what India's doing extraterritorially. I mean, that India will have to address that. Similarly, I think Canada will also have to address, look, what are the ways in which you prevent needless provocations for India. I think the fact that there is a law enforcement dialogue and whatever deals they're going to make, I mean, in terms of satisfying each other, I think the more they do it and, actually build that trust between the establishments, that is the security establishments, as opposed to declaratory, you're not going to sign major declarations on this. Like Carney mentioned, look, that is a concern. He put it right up there. Mr. Modi talks about terrorism. So I think these things, if the legal and the security people start actually dealing with them, then I think the need to publicly argue or criticize about it will become less. And we've seen it partly in the US case after the inquiry, and you saw that I think has blown away a little bit. But in the Canada case, the issues are far more serious. But I would say there's a larger question, I think, which is really, look, the subcontinent's population is exploding in the English-speaking world. That is Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans. I mean, they today, the kind of diasporic movement of the South Asians into the English-speaking world, because in the Arab world, of course, you don't do politics, so it's not an issue there. But in the English-speaking world, where they become part of the domestic politics, I think the conflicts within South Asia express themselves in different ways within the Five Eyes, if you will. And I think that is a structural problem. I think, in a way, what happened in the US, what happened in Canada, are a good, shall we say, warning signal that how do you manage this? How do you prevent Indian politics from poisoning Canadian politics, or preventing political mobilization within the Anglo-Saxon, or what is the right word, Anglophone, Anglo-American world from that generating problems for India. So if you look at deeper, what happened on the Sikh issue is really that, whether it's India-Pakistan issue, India-Bangladesh issue. We've seen that in the Sri Lankan case before, Tamils versus, I know the Sri Lankans are big grouse against Canada, how the Tamil issue was played out. So I think what you have is the politicians in this place in the English-speaking world. I mean, they're not deeply into it, so there's a certain way they react because they're being mobilized, the communities, and the communities have voting power. Similarly, India too, I think South Asian countries too have to be sensitive in terms of how this politics, the domestic conflicts are going to spread there. So I would say this is a good moment, I think, for India and the five English-speaking countries. I think we've already seen some progress, I would say, in the British case, I believe. In the Australia has always managed this much better because the numbers are smaller. In the US is even less, but the numbers are going to grow. I think there's no escaping that. The number of Indians, number of Pakistanis, number of Bangladeshis, their numbers in the Five Eyes countries will grow. So I think what we do today must be a template for managing this reality that if you take Indians alone, there are about 30 million people in the diasporic world. If you count all the South Asians, I would say the number would be closer to 50 million South Asians concentrated in the urban areas of the Five Eyes. So this is going to get worse. After all, politics is not going to cease either in the West or in India. So my sense is this is something we have to manage over the longer term, and they're not going to be this high-minded, declaratory solutions to this. What it needs is more sustained law enforcement cooperation, more sustained warning of each other, the potential dangers that are coming. I think that's a direction. In that sense, I would say the India-Canada case can actually set a framework for dealing with this reality, which is going to get worse. I mean, I think Australia, New Zealand, in the US, of course, a much larger population. Britain has already been an issue. So I think this is something we'll have to manage over the longer term.
Great. Michael, I also want to bring you in on this point. Raja lays out a number of issues, including the bigger context of needing to deal with this moving forward, not just for Canada, but for the other Five Eyes countries. From Washington's perspective, and given that the US also had its own case, which was different because it was obviously foiled assassination plot rather than an actual killing, how does Washington see this? With the new Trump administration, is the issue sort of finished? Does the US feel like they received accountability and justice? Is there something that Canada can learn from that? Because obviously, from a Canadian perspective, before we can move too much further, we do need some kind of a process for ensuring accountability and justice. There is a criminal process proceeding in Canada, but what can we get from India in terms of cooperation? So if you could speak a little bit to this and react to what Raja just mentioned on the bigger issues and the fact that this is with us for a while.
Right, absolutely. It's not going to go away anytime soon. A number of interesting data points here that I think are worth highlighting in the U.S. case on this issue. Many had noted with interest that a noted, very prominent Sikh activist in the United States was appointed to head the Civil Rights Office at the Department of Justice in the Trump administration, which suggests that there might be an approach that could go that would go in a direction that India would not like to see things go. I mean, this is someone who had criticized the Biden administration for not doing enough to hit back at India for India's alleged involvement in the attempted assassination of Panoon. And then also there was some discussion about the fact that President Trump would not want to have much sympathy toward an extrajudicial assassination attempt on U.S. soil, given who he is, his nationalistic politics. This happened in New York, his home city. So there's that. But then, as I noted before, if you look at what we've seen so far, the language in the joint statement, the Modi-Trump joint statement, was very interesting. That's not language that I remember seeing any time before. The fact that you had the two leaders agreeing to work together in terms of law enforcement cooperation, and that was explicitly mentioned in the joint statement, law enforcement cooperation to take decisive action against those that target the sovereignty or the territorial integrity of either country. So I think that's a pretty significant sign right there. And also the fact that we have had at least one prominent case that's been made public that we know of, where the FBI has acted directly on Indian concerns and arrested someone. I'd mentioned that case before in California. We'll see where things go moving forward. I mean, the U.S.-India relationship, as I had said before, is it's in a bit of an interesting point right now. I mean, it's still very strong. I mean, strategically, it's very sound. That's not an issue. But, given what's happened over the last few weeks, particularly in terms of the public messaging, mainly from President Trump, but also from several others, including Secretary of State Rubio, I think it's sort of set things back just a bit. I don't think it's going to have lasting impacts or damage on the relationship, but the extent to which these unexpected bumps in the relationship could impact the U.S. approach to this issue of transnational repression. I don't know. Again, I think things will smooth out. It does seem like for now there is a bit of a new approach on the part of the U.S. to essentially sympathize more with Indian concerns, but I do go back to what I said before. I just don't think that the president and those close to him would take lightly cases of extrajudicial killing attempts on U.S. soil. I just don't see there being much leeway on that issue. But again, this is going to continue to play out. It does seem like it's going to play out more in a Canada-India context than a U.S.-India context, and the reason for that is, as it's been for some years, I mean, the nature of the U.S.-India relationship is just stronger, more sound than Canada-India ties right now, which means that a sensitive, delicate issue is just going to be more difficult to address in a Canada-India context than a U.S.-India context.
I think that's a really important point, Michael, that India, US have a lot more connectivity and a lot more depth to the relationship, so that while this issue is an issue, and of course it became a significant irritant during the Biden presidency, that there's a lot more to the relationship. Maybe to that end, if I could bring you back, Raja, on the question of sort of how do we build other areas of Canada-India's relationship? And you have spoken eloquently on the kind of the issues around multilateralism and common agendas around supply chains, infrastructure, energy. Obviously, this G7 also offers us an opportunity to kind of move things in that way. So both by having Prime Minister Modi with the outreach group what would be some concrete things that you would hope could come out, or kind of, again, to bring some depth and build some resilience in the relationship?
No, again, I mean, I think going beyond the declaratory stuff about what we can do, and G7, as you know, is pretty good at this kind of wordsmithery on big global issues. But I think, look, as simple as a trade talks, we had started an FTA negotiation before the crisis began. Then the thing was suspended. So even just saying, look, we're going to resume these talks, that would be because at a time when actually India has already signed an FTA agreement with Australia, with the UK, is negotiating with the Americans. It's also started the dialogue with New Zealand when their Prime Minister was in India a couple of weeks ago. So you have actually, again, going back to the Anglosphere, if you will, India right now, I mean, I think there's so many natural complementarities for trade that it was the politics, the toxicity of the Khalistan issue that kind of, and then all the stuff that has happened. So I think just starting the dialogue on a trade agreement at a time when all other Canadian friends and Indian friends are engaged with each other. So I would say that would be the simplest thing to go forward. Second thing I would say, we've had the history of civil nuclear cooperation that went through a lot of problems after 1974. Then under Steve Harper, many of those issues were sorted out. But today, I think if the nuclear energy is going to be revived in any significant form, then I would say that is again on the energy security. That is something India, Canada can work together. Finally, I would say that the question of the education markets of again going back to the English-speaking world have been a very, very important link between India and the Five Eyes, if you will. Now, given the turbulence that is going on in the English-speaking world, I think attempts of finding, like getting more Canadian universities to India, how do you take advantage of the Indian market, of higher education market that is seeking to spend money, good money, in the English-speaking world? So is there a way we can flip it, where you bring the universities to India? I mean, I would think there is room there again. I would say in a much more comprehensive sense, that it is the diversification question on the economy that we need to. We have a good foundation in terms of the investments, etc. But I think if you bring in the trade question, the technology issue, then I would say you can look at Canada is going to look beyond the United States. India is also going to, needs to ramp up its trade policies. So I think there is a moment there of economic reconstitution that is possible. The fact that India-Europe negotiations, which are largely seen as never going to go anywhere, today they're moving pretty fast, and we see how Canada is reaching out to Europe, India is reaching out to Europe. In fact, our foreign minister right now is in Canada, and the Prime Minister will also stop there. So I think the intra-West relationship, until now, if you ask anybody in Delhi, they say, look, Washington or bust, there's nothing else. But today, I think India is doing a lot more with Britain, with Europe. My sense is India too sees that some of the volatility in the US domestic politics, of course, the US will remain the most important partner for you and for us. But I think to be able to create other sources that can manage the volatility in the US relationship, that has become an important one. And
that's a really
security. I'll just say one last thing on security. Sure. There again, I think you're going to see a lot more activity on India-Europe defense, India-UK defense. So my sense is, I know we've talked about this before on the Indo-Pacific, how much Canada wants to do. There again, I'm sure the two sides can work together to some sense of looking at the broader geopolitics as well as the more defense cooperation as Canada itself raises spending. And I see, I'm quite confident that India is going to participate, just like Canada is, in the in the European rearmament plans. The Indian companies are going to see what they can do take advantage of what's happening in Europe, Europe's own ramping up of defense, which is Canada is also doing. So I would say a lot of new possibilities are opening up, driven not by India-Canada considerations, but by structural changes in the international system.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I want to come back on just one practical point that you mentioned in terms of the renegotiation of the FTA and the fact that India is now in a different moment, because obviously Canada, like everybody else, we have memories of many years of negotiations with India, and those negotiations were never easy in terms of India's more protectionist approach to trade. But now things are seemingly moving, both with the US, but also, as you mentioned, with Europe. If you were advising Canadian stakeholders, trade negotiators, as well as obviously government officials, would it be useful to kind of revive the early progress agreement that we had before, or we are in a different moment and we should have a different ambition for what that negotiation could look like? Are there sectoral things that would need to move forward? Like, what, from your perspective, should be the sequencing on how to approach this?
No, I think just the fact that you revive the process, because the process was suspended. So whether we go even bigger than before, I mean, that's something how the negotiators might see that. But the fact is, just to start the process, that itself would be a signal, look, that there are bigger things in this relationship that both sides need. That, I think, message, if it comes out of this meeting, in the context of the global rearrangement of trade. So there are two dimensions. One, resumption of India-Canada trade. And two, the larger, structural changes in the global trading system, which require all the major trading states to rethink their relationships.
Absolutely. A reminder to our listeners that please put in your questions. We are receiving a few of them. And in fact, one is that I want to pose to you, Michael, and it's a question about the sort of the strategic realignment, or where Canada-India relations might sit in the context of Canada's overall Indo-Pacific strategy and relations with China and others. So I don't know if you want to come in on this, but also obviously comment on anything that Raja just mentioned in terms of trade opportunities in the bilateral relationship. But maybe if you could situate the relationship in the Indo-Pacific, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, coming to the bilateral relationship first, and I think there are two really potentially rewarding, or not rewarding, potentially advantageous areas to focus on. One of them, I think, more controversial than the other. Higher education. And this was mentioned before. I mean, we know, historically, the large number of Indian students in Canada. And if you see what has happened in the US with the Trump administration's new steps and policies being taken vis-a-vis international students, in principle, there could be a major opportunity, a major opening for India and Canada there, subject, I guess, to domestic political factors or domestic policy factors in Canada. But, we don't know how things are going to play out here in the US with this. I mean, some of these steps that the administration has tried to take might not hold up in the courts and so on. So it's hard to predict that. But we're looking at the possibility where significant numbers of Indian students that really would have liked to come to the United States might feel uncomfortable doing so, or might not want to do so. And, Canada, of course, historically has been such a popular destination for Indian students. So having more conversations about that certainly is worth looking at. Second thing, which I would think and hope would be less controversial to discuss, clean energy. So Raja mentioned nuclear energy. But if you look at what it's fascinating what India is trying to do. And on the one hand, India continues to be heavily reliant on coal, and it continues to import significant numbers of hydrocarbons, mainly from the Middle East. But it is very serious about its energy transition. It's set very ambitious goals for 2030 that Prime Minister Modi has made at the COP summits over the last few years. India has taken very concrete steps to set itself up as a global leader for green hydrogen development. It has a national green hydrogen mission, and now has a nuclear energy national mission too. But it has been able to attract a lot of interest, private sector interest, from many clean energy companies in Europe. But I would argue increasingly Canada as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Canada is a top 10 clean energy investor. I think it's number 8 or so. Yeah. So there could be some synergies there. And India is very receptive to this type of investment. And again, to the extent that I've been tracking this, European companies, particularly those from France and Germany, have made some pretty significant inroads in solar and wind, and as well as more recently green hydrogen. So, and I think this is certainly something for the two to look at. I noted that the stated priorities of the G7 summit, as noted by the Prime Minister's office, the reference to energy did not mention clean energy. It just said energy security. Perhaps that was in deference to the U.S. Presence there. I'm not sure, but I think clearly there are synergies here between between Canada and India and the clean energy fronts. I think that's certainly seems to be something worth pursuing. To your point about, Indo-Pacific, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons why India-Canada relations had enjoyed significant levels of success in recent previous years, was generally speaking shared strategic views about the Indo-Pacific, particularly in terms of China and the challenges that it poses in that regard. But my sense is that China and India also uh, have similar types of concerns about China in terms, not just in terms of its power and what it's doing in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific more broadly, but other wider concerns as well. So I think that suggests that if this relationship is able to get back on track to the point that you could start having regular high level engagements across the board, multi-agency, that type of thing. Yeah, there could be scope for conversations about these issues around the Indo-Pacific. Now, we still have yet to get a sense as to what the US's position on the Indo-Pacific is. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that the Trump administration will essentially continue with what the Biden administration did, which continued on what the Trump administration had done initially. Of course, we know that it was the first Trump administration that really looked to revitalize the Quad, which has become such a big part of the Indo-Pacific strategy from a US perspective. Obviously, Canada doesn't play a direct role in that, but the broader issues, I think there's a lot of shared interest. Um, I think the U.S. The Trump administration is not prioritizing Indo-Pacific issues right at this moment. I think it's more focused on trying to end wars, and it certainly is more focused on issues closer to home. But I do think that as we get deeper into the year, based on conversations I've had in Washington, we could start to see a more clear approach from this administration about its actual strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, there's still a number of senior posts in government that have yet to be filled. It is notable that right now, just this morning, the nominee to be the next Assistant Secretary for South Asia at the State Department, his hearings, Paul Kapoor, they've been going on as we speak. So I think also once the administration fills more of these key posts focused on in the Indo-Pacific, focused on South Asia, we could get more clarity from the U.S. And I think that could allow us to better get a sense as to how to look at the broader strategic picture in terms of U.S. thinking fits in with that of Canada and India on these Indo-Pacific issues.
No, that's great, Michael. And we have a question from a journalist at Hill Times, which kind of broadens this a little bit and brings in Pakistan. Speaking of President Trump and not knowing where he's going, it seems like he's also interested in doing more investments and looking at critical mineral deals with Pakistan. There's also talk of Canada doing the same, in fact, and potentially negotiating an investment agreement. To what extent that will impact, obviously, both US-India relations and how India would see if Canada, in the context of trying to both stabilize its relations with India, but also started to engage more with Pakistan, sort of, if both of you, Michael, maybe you start, and Raja, if you could come in on this question as well, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. Very briefly. I think we do know where the Trump administration is going on this issue. It seems genuinely committed to pursuing opportunities in critical minerals in Pakistan, which I and many analysts think is an extremely risky position to take. Um, it's unclear how much this interest will endure, quite frankly. But for now, and so it's hard to say. I mean, sort of brings up the question: would India look at this as something that might make it more inclined to take more seriously opportunities that Canada might offer on India-Canada cooperation on critical minerals. I don't know, but I do think that the Trump factor looms large here, and I think this gets to a bigger point that some of these Trump administration policies do create opportunities for India and Canada, and trade is another, in that both India and Canada have been targeted by the Trump administration's tariff policies. Both countries will want to look for deals with the U.S. to reduce the likelihood that the tariffs will snap back. India is on its way to getting a deal with the U.S., but this administration in Washington, one thing that I think one could say is that there are some areas where one could look at openings that are created for both India and Canada by some of these unconventional positions that this administration is taking.
Raja, if I could bring in, how is India seeing this?
Look, I don't think India should grudge if Pakistan finds a way of, making some money. For us, I think the problem really has been Pakistan's elite, its military, is hardly focused on the economic issues. 26th IMF program, we haven't seen a single major structural reform. So I think, look, if Pakistan actually goes towards, discovers some massive amounts of rare earths. Look, in all these areas, the talk is very different from what actually happens. Ukraine was supposed to have had this massive amount of rare earths, and Trump was going to take it place. So I think there is a lot of this, fancy, you suddenly found a kind of talisman or, a single issue that's going to transform US-Pakistan relations. Look, Pakistan's problems really that it has not done serious economic reform at home. It has major structural issues. And tell me, if Pakistan has rare earths minerals, wouldn't China be the first one to do it? I mean, China has the most expertise. So I think there is a bit of this, constructing a seemingly dramatic possibility with US and Pakistan. But I don't think India should grudge any progress in Pakistan towards greater economic prosperity would actually be good. A Pakistan that thinks economically would be a better partner for India, rather than a Pakistan that historically its military rulers have downplayed economic growth. They've really thought somehow the stuff will get taken care of it by itself. It has not. So I don't see whether Trump and others talking about the sudden wealth in Pakistan. I don't see that of any consequence because for India-Pakistan relations in the near term, or for India-US relations, because look, India has a trade of $200 billion with Pakistan. With the United States. Pakistan, I think Michael might give you more details, at $10 billion. So when Trump says, I'm going to do more trade with both, what does it mean? It means nothing. It somehow he's got in his head, look, I got to do something with both the countries, fine. So good luck for the Pakistanis. And the real, mineral deals is really Canada, Australia. These are the real countries with the critical minerals. And I think there, India and Canada should simply focus on, we are members of the MSP, Mineral Security Partnership. So let's focus on that. This kind of headline stories about the sudden, there is some big possibility. That I think the proof of the pudding is actually seeing see any major investment by the United States. We heard the same about the Bitcoin. If somebody says, look, we're going to put in trillions of dollars. So let's see actually if anything happens, because I think if something happens, it's good for Pakistan. If Pakistan can find a new niche, that would be better than only talking about Kashmir and nuclear stuff.
Great. We have a couple more questions that I think would be useful to get your views from. This is from an author at the Hub, and they're asking, what are some ways that Mark Carney could more explicitly address India's concerns around terror and security? What are some messages that could potentially come out? So that's obviously, Raja, maybe from India's perspective, is there anything useful that can be said? But then let me also ask the opposite of what India is prepared to say and or do to address Canada's concerns at this juncture.
No, I would say, look, forcing this, a public posturing or positioning on these two issues is not going to be helpful. And I don't think for both the countries, the key is the law enforcement dialogue. If the two systems begin to say, look, let's fix some of these problems. If something bad has happened, how does India help clean up that operation? or how does India's complaints get addressed? So I think for almost 2 years, we just public debate only on these high principles relating to these issues rather than actually problem solving. My sense is we should leave the two governments to actually begin to solve the problem rather than this kind of public posturing on both sides, the grievances. Framed, I think politics, is art of possible. My sense is the very fact that the invite has come and no relationship between any two countries can be said, look, there's only one issue. It never happens like that. So I think the last 3 years have been pretty bad, but now I would think while we need to fix these problems, at the same time, if we do more cooperation, then I think that provides a more conducive context for sorting out the mess that had been created.
So in some ways, you're saying better not to focus too much on this set of issues and try to talk about the various areas for cooperation that you've mentioned.
You have to do both. Leave this in the administration, both sides are talking about it. Let's see where that goes. Meanwhile, you can do other things. So it's not that either or other, or we ignore the issue which Canada has raised, nor India has raised. So I think that's where the people who deal with it, if they start finding ways of reassuring each other, and the rest of it, then the relationship can then move forward.
Michael, if I could bring you in on this, maybe from a kind of a Washington outsider perspective, there are many voices in Canada, some among the C groups, but also some among others who say that it might be too soon to invite Prime Minister Modi, given the kind of the open nature of the case that's currently going through the courts here. Sort of, how is that viewed from Washington, or in your view, other major G7 members? Like this idea of how do you deal with the difficult issue of transnational repression while also recognizing the importance of engaging in dialogue?
Right. Yeah. So a few comments on this. First, I would completely agree with what Raja just said about messaging. I think that given where things are at with this issue of transnational repression, all this, less is sometimes better in terms of what's said about it. And in the brief that I wrote for you, I essentially argue that to the extent that you're going to have public messaging from the Canadian government about the relationship with India, better to focus on the commercial economic issues, which are much less difficult, especially now. And again, I go back to what I said before about how the India-Pakistan conflict has accentuated the sensitivities of this issue. So, to your question, yeah, I think here in Washington, we don't hear the phrase values-based anymore, because we don't hear this from the new administration. I mean, obviously, this was something that we had a lot with the Biden administration. This is not something that is a focus for the Trump administration. As I had said before, what little we have seen to this point suggests that this administration is more willing to be sympathetic to the India position on this than the Biden administration was. I'm not necessarily sure that the Trump administration has any strong views right now about how this is all playing out in Canada, to be quite honest, and that might be a reflection of where things stand with the U.S.-Canada relationship in the Trump era as well. But I would just put it this way in terms of signposting what to expect on how this security issue, and specifically this Khalistan issue, could bear on the India-Canada relationship moving forward. I think we're going to get an indication very soon. I would think that there will be some protests in Canada against Modi when he's there, and how the Canadian government, how it conducts its messaging about these protests, if it conducts any messaging at all, how it handles them, how many of them there are, that type of thing. I suspect that New Delhi will be watching this very closely. I'm not sure if Washington will be watching this very closely, but I suspect that New Delhi will. Raja should feel free to correct me if he disagrees. And so I think we might get a bit of a sense just in terms of how that plays out, to the extent that you have demonstrations against Modi, and how those are handled by the government, if they're handled, any messaging that comes with it. I mean, to me, it seems inevitable that there'll be some type of protest.
Absolutely. Maybe, Raja, if I could bring you in on this to react to what Michael just said, but also maybe to speak to what would success look like from Delhi's perspective for this G7 participation and for the a bilateral meeting that is likely to take place between our two prime ministers?
I don't think India will object to, freedom of protest. I mean, that's part of the life in democracies. So I don't think India is going to object to those demonstrations. I mean, I think the question is, historically, last many years, is the targeting of the diplomatic personnel, the targeting of the embassy. So where the lines have got blurred, I mean, I think there are protests. I mean, it's natural. And I think there are protests. You see New York at the UNGA. I mean, everybody's protesting against somebody or the other. So I think that's natural. I mean, the question is how these protests were tolerated or they cross certain limits in terms of what they do to the Indian diplomatic personnel. That I think is an issue. That I think we saw it in all the countries it has happened, but some countries are beginning to act on it. So I think those are manageable. It's not that those are impossible to manage. Once you recognize the gravity of that situation. So I don't think India is saying don't have any demonstrations. It's saying, look, demonstrations, free speech, all that is fine, but must be some limits somewhere where it begins to restrict or acts against the interests of the other nations. But again, as I said, look, that is something, nobody has a control over these things happen. But the main thing is the resumption of the larger process. So you're not going to solve one meeting, problems between India and Canada. Are you going to lay out this ambitious agenda? First thing is to start talking, where the two systems begin to engage, both on the difficult issues as well as on the possible progress on commerce, technology, multilateral cooperation. So I think just announcing a broad agenda, that's good enough, I would say, in one meeting, and see where it takes us while the rest of the domestic politics in both the countries will go on. I mean, I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon.
Absolutely. Michael, if I could bring you in to speak to the issue that you just raised yourself, if you were advising Prime Minister Carney in terms of how to handle should there be further pushback. I mean, he's received some already, but not as much as I think some might have feared. In the kind of the days of the G7 leaders meeting itself, which is just upon us, what would be the best way for Prime Minister and his team to navigate the potential pushback and the messaging around it?
Well, yeah, it's a very delicate issue. And I would agree with what Roger said right at the start, that the Prime Minister deserves praise for how he has handled a very sensitive issue already. I mean, he didn't shy away from it when he was giving that press conference. He was explaining why India was invited. He made reference to India's global significance and all that, but he said that, there is space for discussions on law enforcement. And I think that's the best way to put it. I agree with Roger. You don't want to get into it too much. You don't want to bring up specifics. No need to comment on past incidents, including the investigation that are going on now. I don't see any reason to comment on that publicly at this point. Focus on the agenda, the stated agenda for the G7 summit, which largely focuses on geoeconomic issues. Though I did notice it is quite interesting that the first stated priority, peace and security, one of the things that he mentioned was foreign interference, countering foreign interference, and of course, India has been accused of electoral interference previously by the previous Canadian government. So I guess that's something that definitely you wouldn't want to bring up publicly in reference to India at this delicate moment. But I would just say very briefly, I think that the broader issue here is the way forward. And I would just say that there's a 5-month window, as I would describe it, that starts when Modi arrives in Canada for the G7 summit and goes until November. November is when the G20 has its leaders summit in Johannesburg, and we can expect Carney and Modi to be there. If the two sides can make some progress on the issues we've been discussing, trade, strategic issues, including Indo-Pacific issues, if they can start talking again, perhaps that could set something up for a more substantive encounter between the two prime ministers in November. Because I doubt, when they meet on the sidelines at the G7, they're not going to have all that much to discuss. But if there is progress that's made over the next 5 months up to November, maybe there could be some type of breakthrough engagement in Johannesburg.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good place for us to finish this conversation. We can go on with many more questions. And thank you so much for everybody who's joined us. But I think, Michael and Roger, you're both right that it was necessary. It was almost a geopolitical and strategic necessity for Prime Minister Carney to invite Prime Minister Modi to the G7 summit, given what's on the agenda, but that there are both opportunities and potential risks bilaterally in this invitation that needs to be handled with some care and finesse in the next few days, but that we really have this window now of 5 months, as you pointed out, Michael, for in the lead up to the G20, to get moving on a few things, to continue with the law enforcement process, to maybe have the announcement of the high commissioners, restart that, diplomatic engagement at the highest level, to also maybe restart conversations on the FTA. But of course, all of this is happening in the context also of negotiations that Canada and India are doing bilaterally with the US. So the Trump factor, I think, is relevant here, which again, as you both pointed out, gives us opportunities, but also some potential risks to manage. So a lot more to watch. We hope to have both of you back for maybe a follow-up conversation in a few weeks to see where things stand, both in terms of the G7 agenda as well as in the bilateral relationships. Again, thank you so much for the two of you for joining us and for all of your contributions to our work. I encourage everyone to check out the website to see more from both Raja and Michael. And also a huge thank you to our team in Vancouver who joined us early to make this webinar possible. Really a huge word of thanks to them and to everyone who joined us. Please stay in touch through our regular Newsweek channels as well as our website. Have a wonderful day and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.